claim him. A more practical and a braver man would have constructed some manner of shelter in which he might have spent his nights in comparative safety and comfort. But Waldo Emerson's education had been conducted along lines of undiluted intellectuality. Pursuits and knowledge which were practical were commonplace, and commonplaces were vulgar. It was preposterous that a Smith-Jones should ever have need of vulgar knowledge. For the 22nd time since the great wave had washed him from the steamer's deck and hurled him choking and sputtering upon this inhospitable shore, Waldo Emerson saw the sun sinking rapidly toward the western horizon. As it descended, the young man's terror increased, and he kept his eyes glued upon the spot from which the shadow had emerged the previous evening. He felt that he could not endure another night of the torture he had passed through 4 times before. That he should go mad, he was positive, and he commenced to tremble and whimper even while daylight yet remained. For a time he tried turning his back to the forest, and then he sat huddled up, gazing out upon the ocean. But the tears which rolled down his cheeks so blurred his eyes that he saw nothing. Finally he could endure it no longer, and with a sudden gasp of horror he wheeled toward the wood. There was nothing visible, yet he broke down and sobbed like a child for loneliness and terror. When he was able to control his tears for a moment, he took the opportunity to scan the deepening shadows once more. The first glance brought a piercing shriek from his white lips. The thing was there. The young man did not fall groveling to the sand this time. Instead, he stood staring with protruding eyes at the vague form, while shriek after shriek broke from his grinning lips. Reason was tottering. The thing, whatever it was, halted at the first blood-curdling cry, and then, when the cries continued, it slunk back toward the wood. With what remained of his ebbing mentality, Waldo Emerson realized that it were better to die at once than face the awful fears of the black night. He would rush to meet his fate, and thus end this awful agony of suspense. With the thought came action, so that, still shrieking, he rushed headlong toward the thing at the wood's rim. As he ran, it turned and fled into the forest, and after it went Waldo Emerson, his long, skinny legs carrying his emaciated body in great leaps and bounds through the tearing underbrush. He emitted shriek after shriek, ear-piercing shrieks that ended in long, drawn-out wails, more wolfish than human. And the thing that fled through the night before him was shrieking too now. Time and again the young man stumbled and fell. Thorns and brambles tore his clothing and his soft flesh. Blood smeared him from head to feet. Yet on and on he rushed through the semi-darkness of the now moonlit forest. At first impelled by the mad desire to embrace death and wrest the peace of oblivion from its cruel clutch, Waldo Emerson had come to pursue the screaming shadow before him from an entirely different motive. Now it was for companionship. He screamed now because of a fear that the thing would elude him and that he should be left alone in the depth of this weird wood. Slowly but surely it was drawing away from him, and as Waldo Emerson realized the fact, he redoubled his efforts to overtake it. He had stopped screaming now, for the strain of his physical exertion found his weak lungs barely adequate to the needs of his gasping respiration. Suddenly, the pursuit emerged from the forest to cross a little moonlit clearing, at the opposite side of which towered a high and rocky cliff. Toward this the fleeing creature sped, and in an instant more was swallowed, apparently, by the face of the cliff. Its disappearance was as mysterious and awesome as its identity had been, and left the young man in blank despair. With the object of pursuit gone, the reaction came, and Waldo Emerson sank, trembling and exhausted, at the foot of the cliff. A paroxysm of coughing seized him, and thus he lay in an agony of apprehension, fright, and misery, until from very weakness he sank into a deep sleep. It was daylight when he awoke, stiff, lame, sore, hungry, and miserable, but withal refreshed and sane. His first consideration was prompted by the craving of a starved stomach. Yet it was with the utmost difficulty that he urged his cowardly brain to direct his steps toward the forest, where hung fruit in abundance. At every little noise he halted in tense silence, poised to flee. His knees trembled so violently that they knocked together, but at length he entered the dim shadows, and presently was gorging himself with ripe fruits. To reach some of the more luscious viands, he had picked from the ground a piece of fallen limb, which tapered from a diameter of 4 inches at one end to a trifle over an inch at the other. It was the first practical thing that Waldo Emerson had done since he had been cast upon the shore of his new home. In fact, it was, in all likelihood, the nearest approximation to a practical thing which he had ever done in all his life. Waldo had never been allowed to read fiction, nor had he ever cared to so waste his time or impoverish his brain, and nowhere in the fund of deep erudition which he had accumulated could he recall any condition analogous to those which now confronted him. Waldo, of course, knew that there were such things as stepladders, and had he had one, he would have used it as a means to reach the fruit above his hand's reach. But that he could knock the delicacies down with a broken branch seemed indeed a mighty discovery, a valuable addition to the sum total of human knowledge. Aristotle himself had never reasoned more logically. Waldo had taken the first step in his life toward independent mental action. Heretofore his ideas, his thoughts, his acts even, had been borrowed from the musty writing of the ancients, or directed by the immaculate mind of his superior mother. And he clung to his discovery as a child clings to a new toy. When he emerged from the forest, he brought his stick with him. He determined to continue the pursuit of the creature that had eluded him the night before. It would indeed be curious to look upon a thing that feared him. In all his life, he had never imagined it possible that any creature could flee from him in fear. A little glow suffused the young man as the idea timorously sought to take root. Could it be that there was a trace of swagger in that long, bony figure as Waldo directed his steps toward the cliff? Perish the thought! Pride in vulgar physical prowess? A long line of Smith-Joneses would have risen in their graves and rent their shrouds at the veriest hint of such an idea. For a long time, Waldo walked back and forth along the foot of the cliff, searching for the avenue of escape used by the fugitive of yesternight. A dozen times he passed a well-defined trail that led, winding, up the cliff's face. But Waldo knew nothing of trails. He was looking for a flight of steps or a doorway. Finding neither, he stumbled by accident into the trail, and although the evident signs that marked it as such revealed nothing to him, yet he followed it upward for the simple reason that it was the only place upon the cliffside where he could find a foothold. Some distance up, he came to a narrow cleft in the cliff into which the trail led. Rocks dislodged from above had fallen into it, and, becoming wedged a few feet from the bottom, left only a small cave-like hole, into which Waldo peered. There was nothing visible, but the interior was dark and forbidding. Waldo felt cold and clammy. He began to tremble. Then he turned and looked back toward the forest. The thought of another night spent within sight of that dismal place almost overcame him. No, 1,000 times no. Any fate were better than that, and so, after several futile efforts, he forced his unwilling body through the small aperture. He found himself on a path between 2 rocky walls, a path that rose before him at a steep angle. At intervals, the blue sky was visible above through openings that had not been filled with debris. To another, it would have been apparent that the cleft had been kept open by human beings, that it was a thoroughfare which was used, if not frequently, at least sufficiently often to warrant considerable labor having been expended upon it to keep it free from the debris which must be constantly falling from above. Where the path led, or what he expected to find at the other end, Waldo had not the remotest idea. He was not an imaginative youth, but he kept on up